Hi everybody, welcome to Sociology of Health and Illness. I am so excited to get started with this class this semester. My name is Guinevere Chambers. I will be your instructor for the semester. Let's jump into it. So getting started here, please review the syllabus on Canvas and look over the Canvas shell. See if you've got any questions, comments, concerns, really getting familiar with this course since we're going to be in this online format. It's going to be very important to know what the syllabus says, all those policies and procedures, and everything that is happening on Canvas. The course will be broken into modules week by week throughout the entire semester, so you can always go to the module for each week and see what readings and assignments are going to be required of you for that week. My email is provided here if you would like to reach out that way. We can always schedule a Teams meeting, phone call, whatever you need if there's something that you'd like to discuss. So the sociology of health and illness is a big topic. There's a lot that we're going to cover this semester, but one of the core concepts that we're going to need to be familiar with is, what is medical sociology? So this is a field in sociology, one of countless subfields that looks at a lot of different things. So we can look at, how humans or, people in society deal with and think about and treat different illnesses and diseases. We can look at healthcare, the structures of healthcare, different kinds of healthcare policies, procedures, how political economy influences healthcare and healthcare practices. We also can look at, how health and illness are social, right? A lot of the time we think about, health and illness, or more specifically illness, as being, something about just biology, right? We're just looking at bacteria or viruses, but there are a lot of layers to health and illness, right? There are physical, mental, emotional, social factors in how we deal with these things as people, as groups, as societies. We also, as medical sociologists, look at doctor-patient relationships and how those interpersonal relationships can play out depending on a whole lot of social and cultural factors. We'll also look at cultural impacts on health and illness, how different cultures, places, areas, time periods, how we all understand these concepts. And we'll spend quite a bit of time discussing disability and disability studies topics as well. So medical sociology is a huge field, and we cannot cover everything in this course. We've only got 16 weeks, but we will get into the nitty-gritty with a few topics and then a good overview of a whole lot of others. Starting off with some basics, just pulling right from the title of our course, it's important that we have an idea of what health and illness as concepts could be. These are not as cut and dry or clear as maybe we'd like to think. There are a lot of different ways that we can understand both health and illness, and there are a lot of different ways of defining and understanding these topics, depending on the cultural context, the time period, the region, the society, who is being affected. There are countless factors in understanding these topics. So think to yourself for a moment, what does it mean to be healthy? And what does it mean to be sick or to have an illness or to have a disability? How do we define these concepts? We have a lot of different kinds of health, of course. We have our physical health, our psychological health, our mental health, interpersonal health, emotional health. There are a lot of different types of health out there. But what does it really mean to be healthy or unhealthy? We'll see as we progress through this course that there's a lot of gray area with these labels, with these concepts, that a lot of different definitions will be framed as very cut and dry, very black and white. This is healthy, this is unhealthy, and, not really looking at that nuance. We will get into that nuance. We'll look at all that gray area, all that variation of how we can understand these concepts in a variety of different ways, how other places outside of the US understand these concepts today, and also how these definitions have changed in the United States, in the culture that we live in, and across the globe over many, many different centuries, and especially the last handful of decades. Another important concept in sociology across the board is the idea of social constructionism, or that something could be a social construct. In medical sociology, we would consider both health and illness to be social constructs. And that might seem a little bit counterintuitive at first, right? We might be thinking, okay, an illness is when you have a bacterial infection or a viral infection. It's all about the biology or the body. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? We need to look at the social and the cultural and the time period context of understanding health and illnesses. So what we count as healthy or what we understand to mean health, it'll vary a lot depending on what culture we're in, the time period that we're living in. These are not universal concepts. The way that we experience health and illness, it's going to be impacted by so many factors, but it's going to be really different from one culture to another. The way that we understand things, especially things like mental illness and disability, it's going to change a lot depending on these social and cultural contexts, right? Every different society and culture will have different ways of constructing ideas and understandings of health and illness. Also important that we recognize that medical knowledge, regardless of where it's being generated or who is doing that research, it's not happening in a vacuum, right? Human beings and our bodies are not super straightforward, right? We're pretty complex. We're kind of hard to understand. There's a lot that goes into medical research. And so medical knowledge, when we do this research, we have a lot of different confounding factors to consider. One important thing to consider as well is, when we generate medical knowledge, who is being researched? And through a lot of medical history, it was mostly certain groups that were being researched and other groups that were being neglected by that research. A lot of research was primarily focused on men, and there was kind of, a neglect of other genders and women in that research, as well as a lot of people of color being excluded from medical research and knowledge until more recently in our history. So the way that that knowledge is created, the way that we understand, bodies and illnesses and health, it's not always as well-rounded as we would like. And that's something that's changing with time, but it's never going to be generated in a vacuum. We're never going to be able to study it perfectly and completely objectively. It's also important to look at how some illnesses are stigmatized, which means they're kind of seen as like bad or shameful or something that, if you have this illness, you should be ashamed. HIV or herpes would be examples of this. A lot of the time, STIs or sexually transmitted infections are illnesses that we see getting stigmatized. And that's interesting because if you think about it, viral or bacterial infections like a cold or flu are not really seen as, as potentially shameful as something like an STI. And that's not something that's built into the virus or bacteria causing the illness. That's our understanding of that illness. That's, morals or values that we attach to those different illnesses, right? And that would be an example of social constructionism. We also see some illnesses that we would call contested illnesses, which would be those that are kind of doubted, or maybe medical professionals or the general society thinks, okay, maybe this isn't real, or, is this something that is genuine, or is it kind of all in someone's head? Obviously, that can be a very dismissive perspective, but we do see contested illnesses as something in medical sociology that we really want to spend a lot of time thinking about. Why are some illnesses seen as more serious or more real or more stigmatized or something that's not shameful? These are all social values that we're attributing to these illnesses. And finally, we also see that not every illness or disease is universal, right? Some cultures have ideas of diseases that other cultures don't recognize. Some places would see, something as a disease or a pathology, right? Something that's problematic or bad, while in other cultures, maybe that's something that is accepted as normal. We've seen a lot of shifting and changing over our understandings of what health and illness both are over even just United States history. But throughout world history, this is something that's been, ebbing, flowing, fluxing throughout all of time. And it's really important that we look at these social factors in how we understand health and illness when we're doing medical sociology. On the topic of social constructionism, again, it's really important that we look at this concept of normal or normality in medical sociology or the social health and illness. So, what does it mean to be normal? Who or what is normal? What is normal health? What is a normal body? What is, normal vision, normal hearing, normal mobility? What does that even mean, right? Is that something that would be prescribed by a doctor or described in medical textbooks? Maybe, but we also have social understandings of what counts as normal or perhaps abnormal. We don't really have a very clear idea of what is normal, but we can usually point out something that is abnormal. And the way that these labels happen and the people that these labels get added to or attributed to is really, really interesting. It's important that we recognize in this class that both illnesses and disability are normal parts of human variation, right? These are experiences that everybody has. We all get sick sometimes. A lot of people are born with disabilities. A lot of people acquire disabilities throughout the course of their life. And that's just a normal part of the human condition, right? We are just, biological machines in a sense. And so it's part of being a human that we get sick and that we endure injuries and that we get disabilities and we deal with these things. And that really is normal. But again, what is normal? In this course, we can kind of think of normality as this, socially constructed concept, this idea that our culture or our society has created. Right? We decide that, certain things are normal, certain things are abnormal, and then when we do that decision, or when we make that decision, we make that distinction, then we move on to valuation of those different concepts, right? We would value normality and devalue abnormality. And that's not to say that this is something that we should do or something that is correct or just or right, but it is something that we do see happening. Medical sociologists are very interested in how we value normality and we devalue abnormality as we understand them today. A lot of human traits we can graph on a bell curve, or also known as a normal distribution if you're familiar with statistics. A lot of things like a person's height, weight, strength, those are things that we might see this bell curve of. Some people are on the lower end, maybe they're shorter, maybe they're average, maybe they're taller. Maybe they have a lower or average or higher body weight, less average or more strength. We could graph a lot of human traits on a graph in this way. So we might say that people in the middle, people who are kind of at that peak of the curve or who are average in a sense, are normal. That's one way we could understand things. But it's interesting to see people who are on these ends of the bell curve. These are equally as abnormal as far as being further from average, but we value them differently. So if someone who has a very, very high IQ is just as abnormal as someone who has a very, very low IQ, right? Both people are very far from that average middle position. They're both equally as abnormal, right? Statistically speaking. But in our society, right, as we understand things today, we tend to see a high IQ as better or more valuable, and we're attributing this different valuation and maybe even morality to people in these different kinds of life positions with different traits, different bodies, different capabilities. And the effects of doing this, of valuing people in different ways or assessing and judging people and their capabilities in these ways, can have some pretty negative, pretty intense consequences. So it's really important that when we're acknowledging that we have all of this variation and all of these, just wide spectrums of human experiences as far as health, illness, and disability, that we really value that variation and that diversity, and we recognize that it's normal. It's just built into the way that human life has been, has always been, and probably always will be. Not everybody is going to be the same. But the tricky thing that happens when we see these differences being valued differently, right? Different people being devalued because of their abilities, because of their bodies, because of their traits. What we see in our society is that resources and power are not distributed equally amongst everybody, right? Not everyone's being treated the same way. Not everybody is being treated well based off of their health and their illness statuses. We see a lot of variations in, the rights and resources that certain communities have in ways that relate directly to their health and illness. So we see, our isms, things like racism, sexism, classism, ableism, phobias, homophobia, queerphobia, xenophobia, fat phobia. We have so many different kinds of discriminatory, biased attitudes and practices across the world, but also in the society that we live in. And it's really important that we look at the ways that these discrimination types affect health and illness, right? How does it affect someone's health to experience racism? What if you go to the doctor and you experience sexism? What if you can't afford to go to the doctor because you're dealing with socioeconomic struggles, right? Maybe you're dealing with classism in your day-to-day life. Maybe ableism, the discrimination against disabled people, is affecting you as a disabled person. Right? There's a lot of different ways that this could play out. The way that people are treated in the healthcare system and in day-to-day life, and the way that those treatments affect our health are really, really crucial for us to study as social scientists and as medical sociologists. Getting into some more core foundational content for social health and illness, there are 3 different models that are very common when we're using, that we use to understand health and disability. So I'll get into the details about these a little bit more, but in order, we'll talk about them as the medical model, which is sometimes also known as the deficit model. There's also the social model and the cultural model. So the medical model, also known as the deficit model, has one primary argument. This is the idea that disability or illness is a problem with the body or the mind, and it should be fixed or cured using medical intervention. This is a very, very common perspective in the United States, and especially within our medical field. This perspective sees disabilities and illnesses as a body failing, as something being wrong with the body. This frames disabled people in particular as passive, dependent, childlike, helpless, and possibly miserable victims of their physical condition. This is not a very positive perspective when we're looking at disability. This perspective can also pressure people to seek treatment, which can lead to the production of profits for the medical sphere through selling things like drugs and therapies and different kinds of treatments, seeking out cures. And again, this is the most common perspective that we see across the United States and our media. You're probably pretty familiar with these ideas. You've probably heard people say things along these lines. And I actually wanted to call attention to this image in the corner here for the organization Autism Speaks. You may or may not be familiar with what that organization does or what they stand for, but they are a great example of the medical model of disability. Essentially, this is an organization that seeks to cure autism. They gather a lot of funding every year trying to search for a cure for autism. And there's a lot of pushback against the autistic community saying, hey, this is a hate group. They're trying to eradicate us. They devalue us. They see us as less than. And that kind of perspective, right, devaluing disabled individuals or devaluing different kinds of people based off of illnesses that they may or may not have, based off of conditions that they may or may not have, that can lead to some pretty scary, discriminatory, and problematic behaviors and practices. So when we see this argument that, disabilities or illnesses are problems, pathologies, failures, something is wrong with the person, wrong with their body, that doesn't give us a lot of room for, being proud of being disabled. It doesn't give us a lot of room for, having a positive life, having a good life with a disability, if we have this kind of negative victim kind of perspective. So we'll talk a little bit more about some alternative models to understanding health and illness and disability. And I think you'll see that they give us a little bit more wiggle room for some more human perspectives. All right, so the social model of disability, the second model that we'll talk about today, the main argument here is that disability is a product of society's inaccessible and ableist environments. Now, this might sound a little bit odd because we are so used to the medical model in the United States. Most of us have probably only heard those kinds of arguments throughout our lives. So the idea that a disability is not about the body or, what is going on with the body, and that it could be due to society and the environment, It's a pretty fascinating perspective. The idea here is that disabilities could be completely inconsequential if the built environment, right, the world that we build, the buildings that we make, the technology that we create, if all of that were accessible, right? If there were not just stairs, but also elevators and ramps everywhere that we went. If there was Braille on, every door sign, every restaurant menu, if there were closed captions on every kind of screening, like a public broadcast or every TV show, if all of these things were accessible, that would make a huge difference for the disabled community. On top of this, if ableist attitudes, again, attitudes or the practice of being discriminatory towards disabled individuals, if those attitudes were less common or completely gone, the idea of the social model is that disability would be pretty inconsequential. It really wouldn't matter if someone had a disability or not, because if we had this kind of world with an accessible built environment and no ableism, then disability doesn't really exist, right? If disability is the state of being, in an inaccessible environment or experiencing that ableism, if those are gone, do disabilities still exist? One kind of major con, though, with the social model is that this kind of overlooks the reality of life for a lot of disabled people or people with chronic illnesses. There's a lot of conditions where, maybe if someone has chronic pain, that changing the world, making it perfectly accessible, having a very accepting environment, and, whatever we could have to have this utopian kind of world, some things wouldn't change, right? People who have chronic pain might still have that chronic pain. And so the social model is looking at, that societal piece, not so much that individual lived experience, that day-to-day life as a person with a disability or someone with chronic pain. And so maybe we should look a little bit at how it's not just about society and the environment. Also, it's important to acknowledge that that kind of utopia, that kind of discrimination-free, fully accessible world is not really realistic. So what do we do in the meantime when, we have these inaccessible spaces and we do have these ableist attitudes in our society, right? What does that mean for disabled people and for illnesses today? What does that mean for our daily lives today? So now we come to our third and final model that we'll discuss today, the cultural model of disability. This model says that basically all disabled people are connected by their shared experiences of ableism. So this is a very community-minded, culturally minded perspective here. We talked a little bit about what ableism is, but again, ableism would be that perspective or that practice of discriminating against people with disabilities or the disabled community. Interestingly, this doesn't actually have to only include disabled people. If someone is perceived as disabled, they could also be a victim of ableism. A couple examples of ableism that we've seen in our, just day-to-day lives, things that we're probably all familiar with, would be inaccessible buildings, right? Someplace that only has stairs and no elevators, so wheelchair users cannot get to those upper levels. Inaccessible media, such as books that are not in Braille for people with low vision or people who are blind, or TV shows or movies that don't have closed captions for our deaf and hard of hearing folks. We also have a lot of ableist slurs and euphemisms. We also see medical gaslighting taking place in healthcare institutions. We'll talk a little bit more about medical gaslighting in a future lecture. We also might see ableist bullying and even assault. We've also seen genocide and murder throughout human history. There are a lot of really, really tragic examples of ableism in our day-to-day lives and throughout all kinds of different cultures and societies. It's also very important to acknowledge that the cultural model pushes this perspective that a person's participation in, the economy or society is not what determines their worth. All people are worthy simply for existing. All people are deserving of rights and support and resources just because they're people. So the cultural model is one that we see in disability studies. It's very, very popular amongst medical sociologists or within the sociology of health and illness field. This is a perspective that is not looking at the body as a failure if a disability is present or an illness is present. It's looking a little bit further than just, those social attitudes. It's looking a little bit further than just the built environment and inaccessible spaces. We're looking at the disabled community, culture, and how all of these things come into play on this larger sociocultural scale. Next, let's jump into a few tips, just things to remember throughout the semester. It's very, very important that we keep these in mind to be respectful of our classmates and also the people and the institutions that we are analyzing and discussing throughout the semester. It's very, very important to remember that language matters. The way that we talk about things like health, illness, disability, the way that we talk about ideas, and the way that we talk about and address each other in a class like this is very, very, very important. I would like to say that this goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Throughout this class, we're going to criticize ideas all the time, but not people, please. Not each other. Let's be respectful to each other. Please be respectful towards me. It's absolutely fine if we disagree. We're all going to have different opinions, different experiences, and different histories coming into this class. But we all need to keep an open mind, right? We're going to learn a lot of new information this semester and probably a lot of things that will challenge beliefs that we might have going into the class. So it's really important to remember that, you don't know everything now. Nobody knows everything now, so we're all learning and growing every single day. Everybody makes mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. So it's really important that if you don't understand something, if you're confused, if you're like, I always thought this was this way and now you're saying it's something different, let's talk about it, right? If you're not sure, just open up that door, take on that learning opportunity. There are absolutely no dumb questions. Everything is fair game. So please, please, please reach out or share with your classmates if there's anything that you want to dive deeper into. If you've got concerns, if you've got a different opinion, we want to have a collaborative learning community here where we criticize ideas, we learn, we grow, we dissect all of these things that are going on around us in the social world, and we come out of this class knowing a lot more about the world that we live in. Another important concept to address early on in the semester is this idea of person first versus identity first language. We're going to talk a lot about disabilities throughout this class, so it's important that we understand what the difference is between person first and identity first language. So person first language would be saying something like a person with a disability, or a person with autism, a person with cerebral palsy. We also have identity first language, which would be like saying a disabled person. If you were using identity first language for yourself, you might say, I'm disabled. If you use person first language, you might say, I'm a person with a disability, or I'm a person with anxiety, whatever it might be. There's a lot of different reasons why someone might prefer one or the other. It's important to remember that neither of them is right, neither of them is wrong. They're both context dependent. It's always important that if you're talking to somebody that you ask them, do you prefer a person with a disability or a disabled person? How do you want me to refer to you? Throughout this course, I have absolutely no problem whatsoever in any discussion posts, papers, anything that you write. Either way, person with disability, disabled person, person with an illness, ill person. That one sounds a little weird, but they're both completely fine. There's no moral difference. But one of the reasons why someone might prefer one type of language over the other would be particularly for identity first language, disability. If you are a person with a disability or a disabled person, that's going to be pretty central to your life, right? It's probably going to affect a lot of things in your day-to-day life. It might affect your relationships, and it might be a very core part of your identity, right? Part of who you are. Maybe it's part of your personality, or it's just such a big part of life that you really can't separate it from yourself. Person with a disability, to some people, this might kind of sound like, you're just a person walking around and then you got your disability over here in a little box, or maybe it kind of follows you around like a dog on a leash. It's not really as core or central to who you are as a person. And some people do understand their disability or they experience their illness in that way, right, where it's kind of separate from them. So we have a lot of reasons why one or the other might be beneficial. Sometimes identity first language is preferred by disability rights activists, really centering that disabled identity. But a lot of people see person with a disability or person first language as more respectful. So again, there's a lot of gray area here. It can really, really depend. It's important that you ask if you're going to be referring to somebody in either of these ways, that you just know what they prefer. For a little bit of personal touch here, I personally also have disabilities. Surprise, surprise, I'm a disability sociologist, and I prefer identity first language for myself. I tend to use identity first language when discussing the disabled community, but it's totally fine in either direction. It's also important in a class where we're going to talk a lot about disability that we talk about people who don't have disabilities as well. What kind of language do we use for this kind of context? So you've probably heard some of these concepts before. I think able-bodied is one that we hear very, very often in our society. A lot of people prefer that term. But you might also hear people say abled, right? Abled individuals or ableds. It's kind of hard to say, but those are also common words that you might hear. You might hear people be referred to as able-bodied. You might also hear the term non-disabled. All of these have different functions. All of these terms are appropriate depending on the context. But in general, in disability studies and medical sociology, the term non-disabled is one of the most common, most accepted terms that we tend to see. The reason for this, instead of saying able-bodied or able-minded or abled, non-disabled kind of centers disability again in the concept or the conversation. Using that non-disabled label, we're saying this is a person who is not disabled, not someone who is able-bodied, someone who has something that disabled people don't. This is someone who is just not a part of the disabled community, someone who doesn't have a disability. Again, all of these terms are totally fine. You'll tend to hear me use non-disabled throughout our class. I like to center disability in the discussion. Even if we're talking about non-disabled individuals, we're probably talking about this community in context of disability studies or medical sociology. So keeping disability at the center of our conversation can be really, really important to give justice and enough grace for the community who we see a lot of discrimination against. We see a lot of rights being stripped away. We see a lot of discrimination. And so if we're trying to fix those problems, or we're trying to, make right the wrongs of our society, centering the community that is most negatively affected in those conversations can really, really help us with that goal. On the topic of language again, I wanted to discuss a little bit about slurs and euphemisms. These would be examples of inflammatory or harmful language that we would see or maybe hear or read in our society. Slurs would be harmful words that are used to put down, hurt, or make fun of a group or a person. In the context of this class, this would most often be disabled individuals, chronically ill individuals, people with disabilities. However we want to talk about that community, we will see words like the ones highlighted red here. I'm not going to say them out loud, but these are words that we've probably all heard or read or seen one place or another. And these are, of course, very harmful words used to directly harm and make fun of or hurt the disabled community. We also hear euphemisms, which are words or terms that are used in place of other words or terms to kind of soften discussion of a topic. So in the context of disability, we have probably all heard things like handy capable or differently abled, special needs, physically challenged, mentally challenged, and so on. A lot of people think that these are respectful, that these are softer, gentler, less harmful ways to talk about disability. There are actually a lot of reasons why disabled individuals and the community might feel not so great about these terms. A lot of people find them infantilizing, right? Kind of treating the community like children or not full adults, not complete people. But it also kind of implies, at least, that disability is taboo or something that we shouldn't just talk openly or frankly about. or that it's abnormal, or it's weird, and we need to soften that discussion. We need to skirt around it and use different words and different terms instead of just saying disabilities. So it's really important that we recognize disabled is not a bad word, right? Saying that someone is disabled is simply stating a fact in a lot of cases. It's not a bad thing, it's not an insult, but the reason why a lot of people might believe that it is because we have, again, the social construction of disability, the social construction of illness that gives us this perspective that disability is bad, that being chronically ill or having an illness can be bad or shameful, that something is wrong or broken about a person. And disability studies and medical sociology does not agree with that perspective. The perspective within this field is going to be that no, disability is just a part of the human condition. It's just a part of life for so many people. And so disabled is not a bad word. It's just a descriptive word. All right, thank you so much for being here for this lecture today. I know that was a lot of foundational information. There's going to be a lot more information that we're going to tackle throughout the semester, but I hope that that gave you a little bit of an entrance into the topic and you're excited to learn more. Next week, we're going to talk about the inequity in the distribution of illnesses and disability. So we'll look at patterns in who gets sick around the world. What are people getting sick with and where and why? Who is getting sick the most? Who is getting treated? What kind of treatments are people getting? We'll look at how different identity factors are related to health. So things like race, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, disability status, country of origin, religion, all these different kinds of identity factors. What on earth do those have to do with our health and illnesses? We'll also look at, in relation to identity factors, how different isms and discrimination and phobias, how these things shape our society's health and the health of marginalized groups, right? People who are not in a position where they have a lot of resources or power or support from the government, from society, from their communities. How are all of these patterns affecting the health and the illnesses that are present, the disabilities that develop or are present within these communities? So it's a really fascinating topic, and I'm looking forward to getting into it with you next week.